directly with industry.
My name is Adam Legg, President and CEO of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, and it is our pleasure to welcome you to today's event. The Calgary Chamber has a long and proud history of being at the forefront of Aboriginal policy issues. In 1980, the Calgary Chamber was the first chamber in Canada to create an Aboriginal committee to familiarize the business community with Aboriginal perspectives and the opportunities of working collaboratively together. Since then, the Calgary Chamber has been responsible for such successful projects as the Aboriginal Workforce Initiative, which provided training for Calgary businesses looking to improve Aboriginal hiring practices, to meet labor shortages and foster workplace diversity. Last year, we were also very proud to launch the Aboriginal Business Connection Series. This ongoing speaker series brings together leading Aboriginal experts, members of the Aboriginal community, and government representatives to share insights on how these groups can build successful working relationships. This series will conclude later this spring with a summary report highlighting insights gained from the series. I do want to point out two individuals in the room today who have taken significant leadership roles in our Aboriginal Opportunities work, and that is our Director of Policy, Ben Brunin, who has really championed the continued work of the Chamber in our Aboriginal, in our work, and the Chair of our Aboriginal Opportunities Committee, Tony Polchis, who has been a stalwart leader, guider, advisor, and just pure passion for Aboriginal opportunities. And she was a speaker at our IF series last night, and I can tell you, brought some very, very wonderful perspective to what we in the business community can do collaboratively. So I want to acknowledge and thank both of those individuals. It's my pleasure to introduce our head table. Our guest of honor today, Anishinaabe National Chief Shawn Atleo, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Dave Sprague, Chair of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce and CEO of Agriculture for Life. Charles Weaselhead, Grand Chief of Treaty 7. Steve Williams, President and Chief Operating Officer of Suncor. Gary Wilson, Executive Director, Government Affairs West, New Alta. Darcy Levesque, Vice President of Public and Government Affairs at Enbridge. Jeff Flood, General Manager of Social Responsibility at Nexon. Nancy Southern, President and CEO of the ATCO Group. Trevor Haynes, President and CEO of Black Diamond. Ladies and gentlemen, your head table. Welcome to a few other special guests. We have Provincial MLA Len Weber and two other representatives of the Calgary Chamber Board, Leah Lawrence and Rob Leonard. Thank you for joining us today. In respect of our speaker today, I would ask if everyone could please ensure all their Blackberries and iPhones are switched off or to vibrate so as to not interrupt our presentation. Also like to thank our series presenting sponsor Suncor for making this series possible, as well as the series supporters Enbridge, New Alta, Nexon, Black Diamond Group, and our series partners CFAR and Treaty 7 Management Corporation. Finally, a thank you to the ATCO Group for today's luncheon. Ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce Steve Williams from Suncor, you'll notice there are some question cards in the middle of your table. National Chief Atleo has graciously agreed to answer a few questions, so please, if you have any that pop up during his presentation, jot them down. Some chamber staff will come around and collect them so that those questions can be posed to him. Now my pleasure to introduce Steve Williams, the President and COO of Suncor Energy. Steve's career with Suncor began in May 2002 when he was appointed Executive Vice President, Corporate Development, Chief Financial Officer. He has served as Suncor's Chief Operating Officer since 2007 and was appointed President and a member of the Suncor's Board of Directors on December 1st, 2011. He has 35 years of international industry experience in the areas of strategy development, corporate performance, refinery, and chemical company management. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Williams.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to be back at the Chamber. I'd also like to add my thanks to Chief Weaselhead for the blessing and recognise the people of Treaty 7 for hosting us on these lands today. So, good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Because of our long-standing commitment to providing economic benefit to Aboriginal communities affected by our operations, we're very excited to be the presenting sponsor of the Aboriginal Business Connection Series at the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. We are extremely fortunate to have a knowledgeable and gifted speaker here with us today, who is working tirelessly to increase the economic and social prosperity of the Aboriginal communities he serves. I'm very pleased to have the honour to introduce him to you. Shawn Atleo is National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. He's also Hereditary Chief from the Howsett First Nation in British Columbia. If you haven't come across or encountered Chief Atleo yet, you'll quickly get to learn that he was born to leadership. His efforts on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations demonstrate his values and highlight his commitment to principles of collaboration, inclusion, and respect. He believes wholeheartedly in seeking first to understand and then working together to create positive change. Prior to being elected as National Chief, Mr. Atleo served 2 terms as Regional Chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations. In that role, he was instrumental in overcoming decades of discord among BC First Nations through the signing of the Leadership Accord. Holding a Master's of Education in Adult Learning and Global Change, Chief Atleo is a passionate advocate of both conventional education and traditional teachings. In 2008, Chief Atleo was appointed Chancellor of Vancouver Island University, making him BC's first Indigenous Chancellor. In his current role, Chief Atleo is committed to helping find ways for on-reserve students to overcome challenges as they may become and continue their education. He also places strong emphasis on the importance of learning traditional values. It's been cultural teachings, he points out, that have been instrumental in guiding him as a leader, negotiator, facilitator, and strategic planner. As National Chief to the Assembly of First Nations, Chief Atleo has elevated the profile of Aboriginal issues and interests in Canada. He does not believe in maintaining the status quo and is working diligently to make significant changes that will improve the lives of Aboriginal people, both on and off reserve. Chief Atleo has been tireless in his efforts to highlight the important roles that First Nations play in our society, emphasising the need for increased Aboriginal representation throughout Canada. Chief Atleo is a truly exceptional individual and a celebrated leader. His impact can be felt not only across our country, but internationally as well. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Chief Shawn Atleo.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Mr. Williams. And tlet go in my language is the deepest of appreciation for that. As well, just a few words in my language to honor and thank the newly appointed elder here, Grand Chief Weaselhead, to say Chu Atik Hat Wehiksu, Treaty 7, Grand Chief Tai Hatwit, Ma Chinopsik, Ma Tikitsu, Sit Yaksa Inchet, His Stuck Shit, Ah Hoset, New Chonotlet, Blockish Beat Ma As. Always is our ways to honor and respect that we're in somebody else's territory. For me, I come from the village of Ahouset, the House of Blockish Beat, which is located on a little island off the west coast of Vancouver Island, as we say back home, next stop Japan. You cannot go any further west than where I come from. Honored to be here, as I have for the last several days in Treaty 7 territory, and to be hosted by the Grand Chief and his fellow leaders who have, just as he said, concluded a wonderful meeting, Treaties 6, 7, and 8. And I was honored to sit amongst them, and there are a number of the leaders who are gathered here as well at this luncheon. As you can see, the Grand Chief, I've traveled over some of his territories. They make the trees here short and the people tall. I, on the other hand, come from the rainforest on the west coast there. I am so very thankful to be back in Calgary as well for this next leg of the journey that I have the privilege to be on. Commenced here, as I've been reminded a few times today, in the summer of 2009, right here in Calgary. And it was a wonderful event, and I know many of you were a part of making that a great success. And so thank you to the business community of Calgary for what you did in supporting the Assembly of First Nations work, not only back then in 2009, but the work not only with the Assembly, but with First Nations. I do feel that we are at a tremendous moment in our history, and I'm so thankful to be amongst so many of you here today. Certainly want to also recognize what an honor it is to meet the iconic Larry McDonald. Somewhere in the room, I don't know where you ended up sitting there, Mr. McDonald, but I don't forget those clashes between the Canucks and the Flames. I haven't forgotten those over the years. But I wanted to recognize your and so many of the leadership's work with young people especially. It means the world. That is really what drives so very many of us. As I said in my language, we do not only recognize Treaty 7 and the Grand Chief here, but Chief Big Plume, that his community were gathered within his territories. I'm so glad to have the chance to meet Mr. Steve Williams, and thankful for the opportunity to the Chamber of Commerce. This invitation, I know we've been talking about it for some time. It does come at a really critical moment. Under the theme of your series, Aboriginal Business Connections. And as with some of the conversations that have already ensued here today, making connections and seeking a better understanding one another is absolutely a key to good business. And I will both be reflecting briefly some of the context within which a discussion like this takes place. I think about Jarrett Cardinal, former chief, I know is now working with industry. Jarrett's a good friend, but I think about your late dad, Harold Cardinal. We think in moments like these of those who've gone on before us and have really paved the way for a new and better day. And so Jarrett, your late dad comes to my mind and heart at moments like this, and it's good to see you here today as well. I believe that it is absolutely key that we continue this work to be able to unleash the tremendous economic potential of First Nations. Today I want to share with you our vision of how we can and must work together to further economic opportunity based on the solid foundation of a renewed relationship. I really believe, as we've already discussed amongst a few of us, that it is not just the ancestors of First Nations, but that in fact, some of you are relating to me that the history of your families runs deep here in Canada, that it's our collective ancestors, both the Indigenous peoples, First Nations of our respective territories, as well as non-Indigenous. They actually got this right. They got this right back during their time. Right here in this territory, when it was the forging of the treaty, Grand Chief, it was the collective ancestors who came together at that moment. Centuries ago. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 builds on decades of treaty making in the East. This codified the Crown's obligations and established treaty making as an essential requirement for obtaining access to our lands and to our resources. When the federal government wanted to build the railway, treaty was needed first. Treaty 7, signed in 1877, continues to this day to be the basis of this relationship within your territory. A relationship that must be reinvigorated and renewed as the source of both our collective history and, more importantly, our future. Just over 1 month ago, First Nations leaders from across the country met with Prime Minister Stephen Harper and Governor General David Johnson, under the premise of renewing the relationship between First Nations and the Crown. And this was an important first step. Our work to achieve change requires us to work together to find solutions. Achieving full engagement and forging understanding is our standard of how we can and must do business together. The priority for First Nations right across this country is that we must, and I believe we can and we will, in this generation, do the work now to achieve this change. This is required to meet our mutual interests and to achieve mutual success. And this, I feel, is an economic imperative for us all. While Canada consistently ranks within the top 5 on the UN indexes, First Nations are well below ranking among developed and even third world nations. And there's a sense of even becoming numb to some of these statistics. The tragic tale of an infant mortality rate that's twice as high as the Canadian average. Rates of TB are 30 times higher, and an education gap that right now at the current rate and pace will take 2 decades to close, and a reality, unfortunately, that our children are more statistically going to end up in jail than graduating from high school. Many of you, and this is one of the first times with the advent of particularly social media, the story of Attawapiskat flooded into the hearts and homes of Canadians, and this community in the remote north of Ontario is severely challenged by lack of adequate housing. And sadly, this is not an isolated case. Of the over 630 First Nations that the Assembly of First Nations supports and advocates for, we expect that there's over 150 First Nations that are facing serious structural challenges, the likes of which we've seen in Attawapiskat, as well as difficulty meeting basic human needs in their own communities. The challenges absolutely are urgent. At times they can seem completely overwhelming. It points to the reality that indeed we have a lot of work to do. But that rather than repeating the solutions, we must rather focus on steps towards solutions and the role that all of us have to play. We far too often focus on the problems instead of beginning to look towards the solutions that are required. And all of Canada, we maintain, has a tremendous and a shared stake in turning this around. By working together, respecting one another, and supporting one another, this makes strong economic sense today, just as it did in the time of treaty. There is an absolute economic imperative that is linked with treaty as well. And I want to explain and set out what I see as needed to do this work together. We've encouraged all of Parliament to work with us, and more Canadians are joining our efforts. Just this week, we achieved another important milestone. Inspired by the advocacy of a young girl, her name was Shannon Kustachin, from none other than Attawapiskat. Parliament this week now adopted by full consensus a motion guaranteeing our children equitable education, a really important step that took place this week in Parliament. Through advancing Shannon's dream, and I had the great privilege to be standing on the steps of Parliament Hill when she spoke, and she absolutely was a powerful speaker. By advancing Shannon's dream, along with a broad call to action, government of all stripes and jurisdictions have now taken a hard look, and they've all agreed that this must change. These are constructive moves that must now be followed by commitment and action. Building understanding and awareness is essential to overcome the misconceptions that have too often led to conflict in the past. And I'd like to set out a path of cooperation for you as opposed to a path of conflict, to envision a future of mutually supportive commitments to economic development and to governance. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People compels both states and Indigenous peoples to work together in mutual partnership and in respect. It also sets out the standard of free, prior, and informed consent. Canada and other states have said that they want to constrict this standard, saying that it's an impossible threshold, too close to a veto, and therefore unacceptable. But I suggest to you that this too is a misconception. Free, prior, and informed consent can work. In fact, it can be the basis of simple common sense and good business. By engaging with our nations up front, understandings can be forged and trust developed and earned. This in turn creates the conditions for mutual and sustained benefit as opposed to perpetual conflict. When free, prior, and informed consent is addressed, it provides the necessary certainty for economic development to flourish, supporting First Nations interests and those of our partners from industry. This new path provides an avenue for developing mutual understanding. It requires us to work with federal and provincial governments to review and revamp regulatory processes and systems, It's a useful and appropriate tool for defining and regulating contractual relationships. And it can guide resource development projects to ensure an open, ongoing, and equitable relationship between business, First Nations, and government parties. This understanding can represent the start of discussions and a powerful means to build the confidence of First Nations and to create successful, mutually beneficial projects. Put simply, it's about building relationships. It's about respect, and it requires discussion early and discussion often. And clearly, it does just make sense. From oil and gas to wind and solar, First Nations are participating in and even leading the development of new opportunities for our peoples, but only when government and industry work with us. The path that I'm speaking of, the one of recognition of First Nations and cooperation between parties, is driving dozens of projects in mining and forestry from northern BC to Alberta here, to the Ring of Fire in northern Ontario, as well as Quebec. And so success, what we're talking about here, can be achieved through the building of relationships up front. We're talking at our table here about, David, your experience in the struggle with your relationship about where you're going to move. And he admitted in the end that his wife won out. And I was thinking about this in real time as we're discussing this very important notion, which has many respects legal connotations and deep economic implications, that it is about a relationship, and that there was, in fact, I'm sure, free, prior, and informed consent. I'm speaking mostly to the men here, I guess, in some respects. That in the end, it is about a relationship. And it's about seeing one another, and it is about working on these challenges and opportunities together at the beginning. That's the brilliance of the collective notion that the ancestors forged when they forged treaty. Because they were talking about that this needs to be a relationship where you truly work together and you do so early on. And that this is the path that we need to remain on. That success cannot be achieved when it's merely a discussion or a decision that's at the back end, or as a legal imperative of consultation that brings First Nations into a conversation when an idea or a concept is already a good ways along. First Nations are very much value-based, and the more I talk to those in industry and who are doing business around the world, we were recently in China in the fall, and I was introduced to Huanqi, the notion of relationship building. And after we had our humorous engagements where I said, when my West Coast people, when we traveled across the Bering Strait land bridge and populated China, they had a good laugh about that. They started guffawing, and I said, well, 20,000 years ago, perhaps we were one people. When they brought their drums out, when I heard their language, their own language being spoken, when I heard the values that were being described and how they revered their elders in their home, it did feel very much like, this is part of the human family. And there was a deep sense of value-based decision-making, that it was about relationships first. That's what the collective vision was of the ancestors. And it is a brilliant one that we have right here in our own backyard. We are certainly learning around the world, whether it's in India or the emerging economies in places like Asia, that very much this is something that is at the forefront of the business community and the minds. That this is something that I want to reflect back right here in Canada, that we can look at this through a value relationship-based lens, if you will. That the courts have certainly set standards. There's been over 40 court decisions that continue to advance the notions of consultation and accommodation. I've already mentioned free, prior, and informed consent forged by Indigenous peoples around the world as the new minimum acceptable standard. But in the end, it's about Huanqi, it's about relationships, and it's about certainly having those conversations in the very beginning. And that's something that I wanted to take this great opportunity to encourage, because I myself have come into interaction with large projects where the individuals may even change over the course of a long period of time. When a development is first conceived, there's often decades and many people who are involved. And what our personal experiences have been is that very often we'll be brought into a conversation late in the conception of that particular project. making the relationship building a challenging one, and often creating a very positional, conflict-filled atmosphere, the likes of which is our reality today, but it's something that I believe we can all collectively learn from. We can do so by engaging vigorously in dialogue, including at events like this. Some of you were at the event that we hosted with the National Congress of American Indians in Niagara Falls last summer when we held an International Indigenous Energy and Mining Summit, because it became so evident to me that major projects that were happening in Canada, I didn't realize that a tribally owned energy company in California was purchasing energy that was produced in Canada. And so we began to talk about this notion. I had tribal leaders in the United States saying, well, we're very much aware that in Manitoba, that lands have been flooded to generate electricity when the communities are on diesel power that are adjacent to that major development. And so we have to find ways to now link these conversations. Those deeply, otherwise seemingly isolated communities, First Nations, are in every pocket of this country, that they are often isolated, absolutely, but they're also living in the breadbasket of Canada's economy. And it is incumbent on us to see how we might link these and use the treaty reality and the treaty relationship and put that partnership back on the original treaty foundation, if I can describe it that way. And so the forum that we held, and my invitation to speaking series, the likes of which you're having here, this helps contribute to that sense of dialogue, that we can all share a responsibility. I can see these as the first steps in the transformation that's required. In fact, I would go further, that it's essential for the survival of our people, of Indigenous peoples, because we know the past that we've all inherited, that we're all coming out from underneath the shadow of a very dark chapter in our history. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission last week went further. They said it wasn't just a dark chapter, it was an assault on children for generations. It's essential, in my view, to create a path now of mutual respect and cooperation, as opposed to perpetual conflict, to understand the source of how we end up in these conflict-filled situations. It's essential to generate mutually beneficial outcomes. Building Indigenous economies and playing an increasingly important role in the broader Canadian and North American economies, not just here in Canada, but as we found amongst Indigenous peoples, both in the United States and around the world. And we simply must not stoke those fires of conflict and of division, but it's time to light the fire of peace and friendship, the one that the ancestors had started. To engage in dialogue about economic potential in our territories and the potential to yield benefit for all of our surrounding communities. Following this new path will affirm and strengthen First Nations, reduce conflict, and allow us to build a stronger, more prosperous, and more just and fair country for everyone. Our work together is to get on with the business of implementation, not of denial. Our nations and our young leaders have growing confidence, determination, and conviction to deliver a better day for our peoples. Our nations stand directly in the path of tremendous resource development potential. Just as in the days of the fur trade, our nations are once again an important part of the landscape to succeed. Partnership and alliance will produce mutual benefit and will strengthen the Canadian economy overall. I do see, as I said earlier, that we are in a moment of reckoning, where what was once wrongly referred to back in the late 60s, alas, the Indian problem is still with us, that it's time that we turn this around and we see this now as the potential of First Nations, the potential of Indigenous peoples. And economists are increasingly helping us to understand this. We now know that if we close the gap in education, if we close the gap in the labor market, that in one generation this would produce, just by First Nations contribution alone, an additional $400 billion to Canada's economy and result in savings of $115 billion in government expenditures. The stakes are high and they're going up all the time. Our collective future is one where we share an understanding of the need for First Nations to be full participants in designing a collective future for our communities and for the country as a whole. First Nations have a great deal to offer the business community, and we must change the way we engage each other to fulfill the true economic potential of the natural resources in this country. As stewards of the land, we have specific responsibilities, and we will uphold those for our communities now and into the future. Because these resources, the likes of which I know there's proposed developments even in my home territories, These are our homes that we're talking about. They're homes that have sustained our peoples for centuries. Our economies have evolved and adapted and will continue to do so. But this is the fundamental point. Development must respect the need to sustain our economies and to create new opportunity directly in cooperation with us. We have no interest in our rights and claims being tied up in endless, costly negotiation and litigation. Oftentimes, we know that there's over 100 court cases that are clogging up the system across this country and are wasting, in many respects, tremendous human potential. It's wasting our time. Based on a clear recognition of our rights, First Nations can and must be full partners in the pursuit of economic opportunity. This path, this is the only path to clear and mutual wins for business and for First Nations. There are a growing number of effective partnerships between First Nations and industry, and I know that there are examples throughout this room here today. From the Crees in northern Quebec to First Nations in northern BC, who are involved in a number of major energy and mining projects. One of the outcomes of the summit that we hosted, we had proposed to establish a virtual resource center on energy and mining. Such a resource center would provide information on issues such as the duty to consult and resource revenue sharing, to where to find financing, to link with Howe Street and Bay Street, to find partners, and to support First Nations to become full owners in major projects as well. We would hope that such a resource center, along with continued education on both government and industry, would result in more success stories. We would hope as well that such an effort could play a role, perhaps, in preventing the type of conflict and current difficulties such as those faced by the Alberta First Nations Energy Centre, which I heard about from the leaders here, and the violations experienced by the Athabasca, Chipewyan, and far too many other First Nations and Indigenous communities in Canada and around the world. Through respectful relationships, First Nations can play a significant role in growing Alberta's economy and Canada's economy. In fact, a failure on our part to advance this work will only continue to drag down economic potential and threaten Canada's competitiveness. With a shortage of skilled labor at a time when our populations across many of these regions are dramatically undereducated and underemployed, it's not difficult to see both the urgent problem as well as the clear solution. Investing in our communities, especially in our children, in our young people, and in our economy, over the long term makes sense for First Nations and it makes sense for Canada. Our contribution goes beyond resource sectors to green energy and new technology, as well as agriculture. In fact, the trip to China that I was referencing, we took that trip with former Chief Victor Buffalo, and he opened up the grain management limited operation on his trade mission. And he also received, rightfully so, the National Aboriginal Achievement Award just last week. Tremendous leadership on the part of Chief Buffalo. I believe that he summed it up perfectly when he said, and I quote, "Like many other First Nations, we have seen much of our lands and much of our resources within our territories developed without our input or consent. First Nations grain management has a different vision, a vision of how we see our lands and agricultural resources protected, managed, and utilized now and into the future, a sentiment often expressed by our leadership. This is truly an important time for Indigenous peoples around the globe, a time when our rights and responsibilities are front and center, and our very survival as well as the potential prosperity. Closely linked to that of the global environment and the economy, this is all what is on the line. Canada has been a leader in the past, forging alliance where other nations sought to merely enslave and annihilate Indigenous peoples. Canada prides itself on human rights and a democratic tradition. Canada must do and can do better in its relations with Indigenous peoples. Now is the time to move from denial to recognition, to respect and implementation of treaty. We are all in this together. Strong First Nations will make for a strong Canada, and I encourage all of you to join in our determined effort to reset and renew the best of this country, a heritage of partnership and of treaty. And in closing, let me sum up that I believe Canada needs, and it's time for, a new story. Canada is more than two founding nations. Canada is more than a cultural mosaic. Canada is more than a nation of immigrants. Canada is built on a proud heritage of strong, proud Indigenous nations. So you see, our new story is actually a very old one. It's a story of proud nations with an abiding respect for the environment, of trade, and of alliances of governing systems that respect the rights of all. Our news story pushes away once and for all the failed attempts at assimilation and the outrageous denial of the existence and rights of Indigenous peoples. Our news story recaptures the dream of all of our ancestors, the dreams of the Turo Wampum, of canoes traveling side by side, the dreams of the original treaties of peace and friendship, and the dreams of the explorers from Europe who imagined a different kind of society, of real respect and of real partnership. I believe we have the tools, especially in rooms like this. We absolutely have the energy. Now is our time to live this news story and write it together. Thank you very much.
We may have time only for a few questions. Okay. You want to head to the podium?
Okay. Yeah. Q&A, yeah. Okay. How many do we have? Okay. 3 of them? Okay. National Chief, thank you very much for those kind and respectful words to our business community here, not only in Calgary, but throughout the country. I've had the privilege of reaping the benefits of being an elder already. I had my picture taken with Chief Weasel Rabbit, better known as Lanny MacDonald. And I've also had the honor and privilege of sitting by the Alberta Business Person of the Year, Nancy Southern from ATCO. National Chief, we've had a long week together. So if I may, just present a couple of key questions for you. Number one, how do we work together to avoid conflict in accessing and transporting Canada's energy resources in a way that works for the Aboriginal communities and industry and government?
Well, that's simple. That is the crux of, or it suggests a good entry point for the crux of the challenge. Part of the reason for choosing to hold an International Energy and Mining Summit was just such a question. And it was the recognition that that First Nations very much have experienced energy differently than others. And based on treaty, have the right and responsibility to not only be a part of the discussion, but in my view, we have nothing less than to accept the responsibility to bring our vision to what the current and future of major resource development, including energy, is. And that means raising the literacy amongst all of us about energy, the energy conversation. My little home is off-grid, solar-powered, and when you take a decision like that, you really begin to think about your relationship with energy differently. What became apparent to me, and I really know only enough to get myself in trouble, especially in a crowd of such knowledgeable people and experts, but it seems very clear that we have yet to form a real vision around energy and our relationship with it, not just in Canada, but it became clear to me internationally as well. You see, our interaction with Indigenous peoples will include those in South America who have, again, a different lens or viewpoint through which to have a relationship with energy, with oil and gas. There are very many, not only Indigenous rights issues, obviously there's political and there's economic issues, but I think part of addressing this conflict, I was speaking about in my speech today, and that is that First Nations must step forward and be a part of a vision for energy going into the future. This is really the only way. We don't see ourselves reflected back. The best, worst examples is when you're a community who's been dispossessed, you've been moved from your homelands, not once, not twice, but 3 times. to make way for energy development that's being sent to a southern city when you're on diesel. As I grew up playing in a little puddle of diesel beside my home in my village. And so I know what that feels like. So we can see how disparate we've been. We've been so separate in these conversations. And it is time, and I certainly not only encourage the regulators, we're encouraging governments to address this, to return us. And that was the whole point of the January 24th meeting with the Prime Minister and with the Governor General, was to look to the Crown partner to say, put this back on the treaty partnership basis. And they have committed to working with us to strike up an economic task force. They've committed to do so shortly. That would help address or look at the major barriers in the area of economic development. And so we would hope that there would be support and encouragement from his industry, that we share an objective here to get this work done. There's other work as well, interested to work on treaty implementation. You see, these are not separate. The conflicts on the ground with business and industry are directly related to the need to see that treaties are real. Today is the day that they were entered into, and they need to be implemented. And certainly we look to the governments for leadership, but the notion that we are all treaty people applies here, whether you're a newly landed immigrant or your family's been here for generations. We're reaching out to Canadians to ask for a shared notion of what treaty implementation means. It is very much a structural shift that's required. And so I think to conclude on this question, to begin in the way that I did, I can only properly end on a similar note, that there is the hard way or the harder way to address that. The harder, more difficult way is what I was doing in grade 11 when I was failing math twice. I was avoiding the hard work. That's what my father would remind me when I said, it's too hard, I can't do it. Well, you can have what you say, son. It's too hard, Dad. There must be an easier way. You can have what you say, son. So it was too hard. It was too difficult. I ended up learning that the hard way was to apply 100%. Do the effort that's required. Get out of my own way so that success could ensue. And isn't that also what we bring to our business and professional lives, is how do we get out of our own way and open up the opportunity for real success to ensue? Well, there is only one way. We've been on the harder path up until now. And it's been one of deep separation, disconnect, and it's been supported by policies that have not looked to bring us together and have not sought to acknowledge or recognize the reality of treaty rights or Aboriginal title rights. And so to create certainty is something that we can do together by forging a different way of relating to one another. And there is no magic bullet here. It is the hard work that we absolutely must get underway right now in all segments of Canadian society. Must be led by business and industry. It must be about alleviating the issues of poverty in our communities. And of course, I think education is a key door that we must walk through together to unleash the potential of our young people, and to make sure that every Canadian is supported to understand what the Grand Chiefs Treaty means here in Treaty 7, that the children here would know, grow up and embrace that they are treaty people as well.
Thank you, National Chief. Steve, I understand we have the same culture at home. My wife told me, don't stand up at the podium for 20 minutes and talk. Say something. Second question, National Chief. What can business do to strengthen Aboriginal business relationship? How do we build a treaty relationship in BC where we seek to build West Coast access?
So it sounds to me like you're in part talking about the resolution of negotiations, whoever brought forward that question. In my remarks, I talked about this notion of denial versus recognition. For the legal minds in the room, you're probably well aware. In fact, if you're at the front lines in industry and First Nations relationship, will know that there still is a legal foundation of non-recognition and or denial that exists. And it creates great consternation. It's why First Nations have been pushing for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which does provide recognition that we are indeed peoples with an S at the end. The direct experience for me was in litigation with Canada on fisheries, where a Crown lawyer came in front of me in my own village. I was wearing my regalia, and the Crown lawyer said, "You as a Howsit and as Nuu-chah-nulth, as a peoples, you don't exist." In other words, there's this sense that somehow that we as Indigenous people, somewhere along the line, and it is the complete antithesis of what the treaty relationship was, which was a relationship between peoples. But what's emerged here, and there are many reasons for the genesis of this reality, is that Indigenous peoples are not recognized in a formal manner. And even the negotiation processes that are draped around the framework of Canada's negotiation policies, they have, A, not kept pace with shifts in common law over 40 court cases. They do not respect nor support treaty recognition or implementation. They do not implement Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, the Royal Proclamation. And so we still have a structural challenge. We are not whole in many respects in the relationship between First Nations and Canada. And so to rely simply on the negotiation policies is to rely on something that in regions like BC have simply not produced the kind of results. There's over 400 million in accrued loans, a very small number of concluded deals, and based, as many would suggest, based on a foundation not of recognition, but attempted extinguishment and or modification of rights. And if that's the case, then Indigenous peoples would be the only segment of a society in a place like Canada where the state is attempting to minimize, reduce, extinguish, or modify rights. And so First Nations simply will not stand for that. And I think that when most Canadians understand and appreciate that, given that you're a party to treaty, you wouldn't want to see the treaty parties' rights diminished either. You would want this to be in keeping with the spirit and intent of what the ancestors had described. And so, again, I come back to this notion that we've got twofold, a parallel effort here. The federal government on the 24th, they agreed to work with us to address that negotiation policy, and we need support. Because by getting clarity on the relationship between First Nations and governments, between clarity in the regulatory processes, we can both drive certainty for our economics. And that's what everybody is aspiring to. First Nations don't have that. We certainly are being asked to deliver that to the economy, while First Nations are seeking the same thing. In fact, the focus should be less about this notion of achieving certainty and achieving clarity about rights and about the process to give true expression to those rights. And that way we can see one another in a formal manner. So in my remarks, that's what I was referring to. The Crown has signaled a willingness to talk treaty implementation, to talk about the negotiation policy, which is still founded in a sense of denial and extinguishment. They've agreed to look at a fiscal relationship, because contrary to, I think, what people believe about things like education, our young people are the only segment of the Canadian population without a statutory guarantee. As the last Auditor General said, Sheila Fraser, she said, in fact, in her words, to quote, "It's completely arbitrary. She could not determine how the government decided how to fund our children in the education system." And so if we're going to support our communities to prosper, of course we have to support our young people. But we would look to business and industry to consider these elements further and to engage directly with the chiefs and grand chiefs and their experts, particularly as it applies to proposed and current business ventures that are underway. Because there is an underlying structural challenge that we share. It's not just First Nations who have this. And we can probably quantify the cost economically to what's happening in this country. Because if we got on average 100 court cases, most of them are focused on resource development projects from coast to coast to coast. So I do believe there's a powerful economic imperative for us to really now find a way to make a significant transformational shift in the relationship between First Nations and Canada. And I believe that we can look to business and industry to join with chiefs like the Grand Chief here to provide us with the leadership that's required.
National Chief, one more question. Free, prior, and informed consent. How do we get there? What needs to change? What's the role for business and what's the role for government?
Well, that's why off the top of my head, I thought of David's story about how his wife won the argument over his move across the country. But that I'm sure that in the end it was about it's a shared decision. It's about mutual respect, recognition, love, caring, and about deciding together. And that's what the original treaty relationship envisioned, and that's the path that we have not followed. And so we should not be surprised that it's resulted in the kind of conflict and or misunderstanding. Last week, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't just talk about the need to support First Nations, but it talked about the need to support all Canadians to understand fully, legally and in every other way, the reasons why we've ended up in this situation. No one in this room wrote that Indian Act, nor did any of us open those residential schools that have caused deep trauma, division, and the social ills that we have. We didn't create that. But I feel strongly now that we've arrived at a place, particularly because of courageous leadership, the likes of which was exhibited by former National Chief Phil Fontaine when he stood in front of the world and he said, "This is what happened to me." And then governments took up the challenge, and other parts of Canadian society, including the faith community, stepped forward and said, "Okay, well, let's get on with this hard work of reconciling. It's been too hard. It's been harder, the path that we've been on." It resulted in the apology. The Prime Minister stood up and apologized, and I sat there with my late grandmother. She was 87 years old, and I'll finish with this story, which some of you have heard before, but I always think of her at moments like this. We were holding hands when the Prime Minister was apologizing in front of the National Chief, the other Indigenous leaders in the whole country, and she said to me, "Grandson, they're just beginning to see us. They're just beginning to see us." Those were her words. This is coming from a powerful woman in our community. She raised 17 kids, all went to residential school, including herself. And she said, "Grandson, I've been a fighter all my life. I raised all my kids to be fighters. We don't fight our fights with our fists any longer. We fight our fight with education." And I've taken that instruction, because it is instruction, to heart. She said, "You know, we have come from a very dark chapter in our history. But I can see a day when we will move to start writing a new chapter together and be filled with hope and promise. But none of us can do it on our own. Not Indigenous peoples. It's going to take all of us. First Nations, our Indigenous and Métis and Inuit brothers and sisters, and all Canadians to turn this page on this dark chapter in our history and start writing a new one." And so to the leadership that's here gathered, to the captains of industry, to the creators of jobs and wealth, we look to you. We look to you for your energy. We look to you for the kind of caring for a fellow human being and about sharing in the responsibility to overcome a chapter in our history that none of us in this room wrote, but we can write a new one. And that's the message that I wanted to come here to share. That free, prior, and informed consent, it comes back to quan che. It comes back to, as the Chinese say, it comes back to relationships. And Black Elk said that the principle of the universe is relationality. That we as humans, every person, that we have the responsibility to create, maintain, and uphold relationships. We have our collective ancestors to thank for that particular vision. It's one that I adhere to today. I wish you a wonderful day. Thanks again for having me.
National Chief, some very inspiring words, and we certainly appreciated them, and we do look forward to contributing to the news story, especially the mutually sustainable benefits. And on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, the ABC sponsors, it's our pleasure to present you with this blanket.
Thank you so very much, National Chief Atleo, for those inspiring and powerful words. And I can tell you, you have a friend and a collaborator here in Calgary with the Chamber of Commerce in building that awareness, that understanding, and those relationships. So we look forward to working with you in the future. To Grand Chief Weaselhead, thank you so much for your blessing and for the wonderful questions that you posed to National Chief Atleo. I too come from the place of tall trees, so I know exactly how you feel. So in closing, thank you to our presenting sponsors, Suncor, our series supporters, Black Diamond Group, Nexon, Enbridge, New Alta. Thank you also to ATCO Group for supporting today's event. The series resumes March 20th. with a luncheon featuring the Honourable John Duncan, Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. So ladies and gentlemen, know we are at our appointed hour. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you a great balance of your afternoon. Thank you.
Nancy, it's so nice to see you again. Yeah.
And Noah, you're joining us for a meeting this afternoon, are you?
I will, yes.